When people think of mountain deaths, they picture avalanches or fatal falls, but some of the craziest stories start with one reckless choice, one ignored warning, or one climb that never should have happened at all. From a woman who tried to climb Everest without a permit to a couple who paid $570,000 and never came home, these are mountain deaths you won't forget. It was April 12, 2023. Mount Everest sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet. The peak stands at 29,032 feet above sea level. That's over 5.5 miles straight up into the sky. The air at the summit has roughly a third of the oxygen you'd be breathing right now. Your brain starts shutting down. Your fingers and toes start dying. Your body is making a very loud, very clear argument for you to go back down. And the only way to survive is to listen. Every year, the Nepalese government issues a limited number of climbing permits. As of recent seasons, one permit runs about $11,000 per person, just for the right to attempt the climb. On top of that, you need a certified guide, the right equipment, oxygen systems, fees for base camp, fees for the icefall route, and all of it is tracked. Your name goes on a list. You get a permit tag that physically attaches to your oxygen bottles and your tent. Other climbers can see it. Expedition leaders can check it. Officials monitor radio communications. The system isn't perfect, but it exists because people die on this mountain, and the permits are part of how Nepal keeps some control over who goes up and whether they have any chance of coming back down. Yael Banavri, Saskia Patel, and May Aransibia did not have permits. They knew they didn't have permits. They planned the entire thing around the illegality of it. And somehow, incredibly, they thought that was fine. The three of them ran a joint travel account, one of those polished, heavily filtered feeds where every photo looks like it was shot for a luxury resort advertisement. Destinations in golden hour light, matching luggage, captions about authentic experiences and living with intention. They had enough followers to land small sponsorships, outdoor gear brands, a protein supplement company, a travel insurance service that I sincerely hope is cringing right now. Yael was the loudest one, both on camera and apparently in person. She had a way of turning every inconvenience into content and every obstacle into proof that the world was conspiring against creative women. She was the kind of person who described a delayed flight as a spiritual test and a bad hotel room as a character-building experience, always with that specific influencer cadence that makes everything sound like it's being narrated for an audience of people who need permission to feel inspired. Saskia was the one who handled the logistics, or what passed for logistics in their operation. May was quieter in the videos, but no less committed to the project. She had recently started posting more solo content, positioning herself as the adventure purist of the group, whatever that meant. Somewhere in the months before their Everest attempt, the three of them had landed on an idea. They were going to do what no women's team had done before, a fully independent, permit-free, unsupported ascent of Everest. They called it a historic all-female rogue ascent. They said it out loud, on camera, multiple times. They used the word rogue like it was a brand strategy, not a criminal description. They talked about sticking it to the gatekeepers of the climbing world, by which they seemed to mean anyone who had put in years of training and technical work and, yes, paid the legal fees to be there. The permit fee, Yael announced to her camera at one point, was just legalized robbery. Saskia laughed and said they had each saved over $10,000 by cutting the government out. May nodded and said the mountain didn't belong to anyone. The mountain, for the record, very much has a governing body, and it keeps records. To avoid the standard approach through the Khumbu Valley, a multi-day trek that virtually every Everest climber does both for acclimatization and because it's the required route, the three of them chartered a private helicopter and flew directly to the vicinity of base camp. The Khumbu Valley trek is about 38 miles over roughly 8 to 12 days. It's not optional. It's not just a scenic walk to enjoy the views. It's how your body starts adjusting to the altitude before you go anywhere near the dangerous parts. The gradual increase in elevation is what gives your blood time to produce more red blood cells, what lets your lungs learn to work harder, what keeps your brain functional enough to make decisions that might save your life. The women, however, thought the hike was for tourists. Yael said this on camera. She said it with genuine disdain. So they paid a helicopter operator, under the table, through a contact Saskia had apparently found through a third party, to drop them near base camp. No registration, no acclimatization days, no formal arrival process. But bypassing the permit system is far more than skipping a helicopter ride. Everest's Khumbu route is not an open hiking trail. It is heavily monitored expedition infrastructure. To climb without detection, they would have needed access through checkpoints staffed by officials who cross-reference permit lists, coordination with Sherpa logistics for carrying gear and setting camps, access to the icefall route, which requires knowledge of fixed rope timings and ladder installations, and an illegal oxygen supply chain, since every bottle of supplemental oxygen on the mountain is tracked by expedition operators. Simply landing near base camp does not grant entry to the upper mountain. The controlled flow of people and equipment makes a truly rogue ascent nearly impossible without inside help or months of covert planning. They landed, stepped out onto the glacier, and started filming immediately. The first sign came almost immediately. One of them, May, based on the footage that was later recovered, bent over and vomited within minutes of landing. She straightened up, looked at the camera, and made a face. Her hands were tingling, she said. She held them up like she was surprised by them. Her fingers looked pale. That tingling is your peripheral nervous system reacting to hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. At base camp, you're already sitting at around 17,600 feet. May's body, which had been at sea level less than a day earlier, was already starting to protest. The vomiting was altitude sickness. The tingling was her blood vessels constricting and her body struggling to figure out where all the oxygen had gone. Their guide, Nazir, saw May vomiting and hesitated. He knew dehydration was dangerous at altitude, but he also knew they had no privacy and limited water. In his cargo hauling days, porters often rationed water at night to avoid leaving the tent in the cold. He told her to drink a little less. A mistake born of habit, not malice, but a mistake nonetheless. I want you to sit with that for a second. A woman showing signs of altitude sickness, and the advice from the man responsible for their lives was to drink less water. Now, let's talk about Nazir. Nazir was not a climbing guide. He had never been a climbing guide. He worked as a cargo loader for trekking companies, carrying supplies, moving gear between camps, doing the unglamorous physical work that keeps the expedition economy running. He was good at his job. By all accounts, he was a reliable worker who knew the lower approaches of the mountain reasonably well from years of carrying loads. He was not qualified to guide clients up Everest. He had never used supplemental oxygen systems with clients before. He had never led anyone through the Khumbu Icefall, which is the first and arguably most dangerous section of the standard route, a churning, shifting maze of ice towers called seracs, crevasses that drop hundreds of feet, and aluminum ladders lashed together across gaps that would kill you instantly if you fell. The icefall moves, it creaks and groans and collapses. There are windows of time each day when it's safer to cross, and windows of time when you do not cross if you have any sense. Experienced guides know these windows. They know the fixed rope procedures. They know how to read the ice. Nazir had crossed the icefall before, as a loader, never as a guide, and never responsible for keeping someone else alive while doing it. He took the job because he owed money, gambling debts according to people who knew him. The women were paying well, in cash, no paperwork. He needed it. The women knew all of this. This was not a case of someone being deceived about their guide's credentials. Yael, in footage that would eventually be recovered, waved off the concern explicitly. They didn't need some celebrity Sherpa babysitting them, she said. They were strong, capable women who had done their research. They had watched videos online. They had talked to people on forums. They were fine. At base camp, or rather, on the outskirts of base camp, since they couldn't register at the official camp without revealing that their names weren't on any permit list. The chaos started almost immediately. They had packed wrong. Not wrong in a minor way, not a forgotten luxury item, wrong in the way that gets people killed. They wandered into neighboring expedition camps asking to borrow stove fuel. They asked around for glove liners, the thin insulating layer you wear inside your main gloves. One of them needed crampon straps, the metal spikes that attach to your boots and are the difference between walking on ice and immediately dying on ice. These are not items you borrow. These are items you plan for. These are items that are on every single packing checklist for Everest, which are themselves freely available online in guidebooks, from any guide service from any gear retailer that sells high-altitude equipment. You don't forget crampon straps the way you forget to pack an extra pair of socks. You forget crampon straps because you are not taking this seriously. The expedition teams nearby watched all of this quietly. You have to understand the culture of high-altitude climbing. It's polite, it's cautious, people help each other when they're in trouble, but there's also a shared understanding that you don't meddle in other teams' business unless someone is about to die. People took note. People talked quietly among themselves. More than one experienced climber later said they noticed immediately that the three women had no permit tags anywhere visible, and that the man with them seemed unsure about basic procedures. No one said anything, not yet. While filming a sponsorship reel for one of her gear brands, one of the brands I'd like to note, whose products she apparently didn't know how to use, Saskia clipped her harness on backward. The harness is your connection to the safety ropes. It's what keeps you on the mountain if you slip. Clipping it backward compromises that completely. Nazir didn't catch it. Another climber passing nearby stopped and pointed it out. Saskia laughed it off on camera. She said something about how she was still warming up. They were at base camp. They hadn't started climbing yet. The night before they entered the ice fall, Nazir sat down with them, or so a nearby climber described it later, and tried to explain the ladder crossing technique. The icefall has sections where you cross crevasses on horizontal aluminum ladders lashed end to end, sometimes stretching 20 or 30 feet across open air over drops that vanish into darkness. You cross clipped into a safety line, moving carefully, one foot in front of the other, crampons balanced on the ladder rungs. It requires concentration and nerve, and the understanding that the rope you're clipped to will, at minimum, prevent you from falling free. Nazir had crossed the icefall dozens of times as a loader. He knew the ladder technique, but explaining it to frightened clients while his own nerves frayed was different. He stumbled over the details, forgot to mention how to handle the transition points, and gave vague answers about spacing. His knowledge was there, but his ability to teach it under pressure was failing. Yael asked if the safety line, the fixed rope that runs the entire route, was something they actually needed to be clipped into, or if it was just there as a psychological comfort for people who weren't confident. She was, based on everything I've read, completely serious. Nazir told her she should clip in. She filmed herself not clipping in at the first ladder. She walked across it freehand, looking at the camera, smiling. 20 feet below her, the crevasse disappeared into shadow. Inside the icefall, things got worse in ways that felt almost engineered. The icefall is not a place you linger. The entire philosophy of crossing it is speed with care. You move through the most dangerous sections efficiently because the longer you're in there, the more exposure you have to seracs collapsing, to ice shifting, to the general structural chaos of 2 billion tons of glacier doing what glaciers do. Experienced teams cross in the early morning hours before the day's warming destabilizes the ice. They move with purpose. They do not stop in exposed sections unless they have to. The women stopped constantly, not for safety checks, not to manage equipment, but to film. TikTok clips, short videos of themselves in the middle of the icefall with their helmets slightly askew and their pack straps not properly cinched. At one point, 2 of them removed their gloves entirely to retouch their makeup. The temperature was well below freezing, probably around -10 to -15 degrees Fahrenheit in the icefall section, and that's before accounting for wind. Frostbite on exposed fingers in those conditions can start in under 10 minutes. They touched up their foundation and put their gloves back on and kept filming. Then May dropped her phone. She was crossing a ladder, filming herself crossing a ladder, when the phone slipped from her hand and fell into the crevasse below. She immediately stopped, on the ladder, over the crevasse, and announced that they needed to stop because her phone was gone. She shone her headlamp down into the opening as though the phone might be visible somewhere in the dark. She debated out loud whether they could somehow retrieve it. Yael pointed out that it had a good camera on it and that they needed the footage. Nazir stood on the far side of the ladder and waited. They eventually moved on. The phone was gone. The climbers who passed them during this incident kept their opinions to themselves until they were safely out of earshot. They reached Camp Warren, which sits above the icefall at about 900 feet, in significantly worse shape than they should have been. That night, the cold went to work on what they didn't know. Proper storage of boot liners, the insulating inner layer that sits between your foot and the hard outer shell of a mountaineering boot, is one of the fundamentals of high-altitude camping. At night, you pull the liners out and sleep with them inside your sleeping bag, so body heat keeps them from freezing solid. If you leave them in the boots, they freeze, and in the morning, you are cramming your feet into frozen blocks of material. You cannot feel your feet, and feet you cannot feel at altitude are feet that are dying. None of them did this. Nobody had told them to, and apparently none of their online research had covered it. The next morning, one of the women, accounts suggest it was Saskia, reported that she couldn't feel several of her toes. The skin had started to go white and waxy, which is the first visible sign of frostbite. Real frostbite, not the light, reversible kind. The kind where tissue is beginning to die. Yael looked at it and told her it looked dramatic on camera. Nazir saw the white, waxy skin and his expression changed. He had seen frostbite before. Cargo porters sometimes got it on their hands. He knew it wasn't normal, but he later admitted that he knew they were too high to turn back easily, and he was overwhelmed by the responsibility. He told them it might be okay if they kept moving, hoping the descent would come soon. Camp 2 sits at roughly 21,300 feet, in the relatively flat section called the Western CWM, a wide glacial valley that funnels both climbers and wind with equal efficiency. By this point, they had been on the mountain for days without a single rest or acclimatization day. Their bodies were not adjusting because there was no time to adjust. Every morning, they pushed higher. Every morning, the oxygen thinned a little more. It was at Camp 2 that things nearly ended before they actually ended. An expedition leader from a commercial team, a man who had summited Everest 4 times and spent more than a decade leading guided ascents, noticed the 3 tents the women had set up. He noticed there were no permit tags, not on the tents, not on the oxygen bottles sitting outside. Every legal expedition has these. They're attached, visible, and checked. Their absence is not subtle. He walked over and asked politely who they were with and whether they could show their permits. The confrontation that followed was, by multiple witnesses' accounts, loud. Yael told him he was threatened by successful women. Saskia told him the permit system was corrupt and not everyone had the financial privilege to participate in institutional gatekeeping. May filmed it. The expedition leader kept his voice level and said he was simply asking to see documentation that every climber on this mountain was required to have. They packed up their camp and moved it in the dark to a location farther away, behind a ridge of ice where they were less visible from the main cluster of tents. This is the kind of decision you make when you are more worried about being caught than about being safe. Pitching camp in an unfamiliar section of a glacier at altitude in the dark is genuinely dangerous. But getting discovered was more dangerous to the project, so they moved. In the scramble to relocate, Nazir anchored one side of a tent platform incorrectly. The tent held, barely. But for the rest of that night, the women took turns physically holding the tent poles upright when wind gusts hit, because the anchor wasn't strong enough to keep the tent taut. They sat inside and held the poles, in the dark, at 21,000 feet. They also stopped doing radio check-ins around this time, which the expedition community had noticed. Legal teams do scheduled check-ins with base camp and with expedition operators. The check-ins are how people know you're alive. The women stopped doing theirs because they understood that communication logs were one of the ways officials tracked legal teams, and they couldn't afford to show up in any official record. By the time they reached Camp 3, which sits at around 23,600 feet on the Lhotse face, a nearly vertical wall of blue ice that climbers ascend using fixed ropes. The collective deterioration was obvious to anyone who saw them. May had been secretly taking Diamox, a medication sometimes used to help with altitude acclimatization symptoms. Diamox is a diuretic. It works by making you breathe faster, which increases the oxygen in your blood, but it also causes you to lose fluids rapidly. At altitude, where the dry air already dehydrates you faster than you realize, Diamox requires you to drink significantly more water to compensate. May was not doing this. She had taken the drug, felt briefly better, and interpreted that as license to keep going without paying attention to how much she was drinking. By Camp 3, she was severely dehydrated. Headache, dizziness, dark urine, the cognitive fog that comes when your blood thickens and your brain isn't getting what it needs. She didn't tell anyone this was happening. She filmed a short video from Camp 3 in which she talked about how incredible it felt to be above the clouds. Yael was vomiting again, not occasionally, regularly every few hours. She attributed it to the food. She had been vomiting periodically since the helicopter landing, and at no point had anyone connected the ongoing nausea to the fact that her body was giving a sustained, increasingly desperate signal that it was not okay. Saskia's toes were worse. Nobody mentioned it on camera anymore. The section above Camp 3, climbing toward the South Col, and then toward the balcony at around 27,600 feet, is where Everest sorts the prepared from the unprepared in a way that is final and unambiguous. Other climbers on the route, members of legal expeditions with experienced guides, proper equipment, acclimatization days, and functioning oxygen systems, began quietly passing the three women and Nazir, not because they were faster or fitter in some permanent sense, but because the women kept stopping for the wrong reasons and kept making mistakes that slowed everything down. Yael unclipped from the fixed rope multiple times so that drone footage would look unobstructed. The fixed rope on the upper mountain is not a suggestion. It is a physical connection between you and the mountain. That means if you slip, you stop falling after a few feet instead of continuing until you hit something hard enough to end you. She unclipped from it so her footage would look cleaner. Saskia kept forgetting to open her oxygen valve after rest stops. You stop, you sit down, you breathe, you rest, and when you stand up and start climbing again, you open the valve on your supplemental oxygen so that it flows. Saskia kept standing up and climbing without opening the valve. She would go several minutes at extreme altitude breathing nothing before she or someone else noticed the mask wasn't delivering anything. Each time this happened, it was a small additional insult to a brain that was already running on fumes. Nazir had handled oxygen bottles before. Cargo loads often included them. He knew how to read a pressure gauge. But at altitude, with 3 panicked clients, his ability to focus was fraying. He misread the gauges multiple times, confusing the working pressure with the remaining volume. It was the kind of mistake an exhausted, overwhelmed person makes, not a total novice. Experienced guides from other teams who passed them during this section said later that they considered reporting the group to officials. They discussed it. They were fairly certain these women were not legal, and they knew they were in serious trouble. Nobody made the call. Most of them assumed someone else would. Some of them thought the women were close enough to turning around that it might not matter. Some of them simply didn't want the complication. It's one of those things that's easy to understand in the moment and impossible to justify in retrospect. The women pushed through the night. There was no discussion about turning back. Yael had sold sponsored content tied to summit footage. The whole project was built on reaching the top and posting the video. Turning back meant losing sponsors. Turning back meant their followers would ask questions. Turning back meant the entire scheme. The fake expedition patches they had stolen from a dissolved climbing team and were wearing on their jackets to look legitimate. The bribed checkpoint workers, the deleted footage of them discussing fake identities, and their plan to avoid Nepalese climbing authorities would have been for nothing. So they climbed. And the mountain, which does not negotiate and does not care about follower counts or sponsorship deals or how much conviction you carry into its dead zones, was already deciding what came next. Near the balcony, in the dark, with temperatures somewhere around -40 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind picking up from the west, Nazir made the mistake that finished it. He was managing the remaining oxygen bottles, something he had done correctly on cargo loads, but never while hypoxic and sleep-deprived. He sorted them by feel, by weight, trusting his hands more than his fading vision. But at that altitude, his hands lied. He handed the women bottles that felt heavier, but were nearly empty, and kept one that felt lighter, but was full. He didn't know. The margin between life and death had shrunk to a misjudged weight. Yael lost consciousness first. She was clipped to the fixed rope when it happened, so she didn't fall. She just stopped moving, hanging against the line at 27,600 feet in the dark. May found her there. May stood next to her for a while, trying to rouse her, calling her name. Then May started talking about the sponsorships, about how they couldn't go back without the footage. She said this to Saskia, who was sitting in the snow nearby. She said she wasn't leaving Yoel because if they didn't have summit footage and something happened to Yael, it would look like they had abandoned her for views. Saskia, by this point, was not processing information normally. She was deep in the hypoxic fog that hits at extreme altitude when your oxygen is gone, and your brain is working on whatever residual supply remains in your bloodstream. The confusion comes first, then the hallucinations, then the certainty. which feels completely real and completely urgent, about things that are not happening. Saskia became certain that authorities were coming to arrest them. She said it out loud. She said it several times, with increasing panic. She unclipped from the fixed rope, to hide, presumably to get away from whoever was coming, and walked off the established route into the deep, untracked snow to the side of the path. She kept going. Nobody followed her. Nobody was able to. By morning, all three women were dead within a few hundred feet of each other on the upper mountain. Yael still hanging from the fixed line. Saskia somewhere in the snow to the side of the route. May collapsed near where she had last been standing. Nazir survived. He stumbled, nearly blind from snow exposure and hypoxia, into a camp belonging to a legal expedition lower on the mountain. They brought him down. He was frostbitten, confused, and alive. Nazir was arrested and faced charges related to illegal guiding and operating without a license. Nepalese authorities launched a wider investigation into the helicopter operator and the checkpoint workers who had been paid to look the other way. Several of the women's sponsors quietly removed any mention of the expedition from their websites and social media, though not before screenshots had circulated widely. It was June 24th, 2017, and two base camp sat on the rubble-strewn surface of the Baltoro Glacier at roughly 16,400 feet. The camp was nothing like Everest, no tea houses, nothing like Everest's constant helicopter traffic, no cell service. Just tents on shifting moraine, surrounded by some of the most violent geography on Earth. The Karakoram Peak stacking up in every direction, Broad Peak visible to the south, the Gasherbrooms beyond it, and K2 itself rising above everything like something that wasn't designed for people to touch. The mountain's southwest face caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look almost peaceful from below, which was a lie, and everyone at base camp knew it. K2 still had one of the highest fatality rates of any 8,000er, especially compared to Everest, and everybody at base camp knew the margin for error up there was almost non-existent. The Abruzzi Spur, the standard route from the Pakistan side, rose from base camp in a series of increasingly technical and exposed sections that filtered out climbers by attrition and fear long before the real danger began. Among the climbers staged at base camp was Vasco Noronha, 26, from Lisbon, Portugal. Vasco was basically a fitness and adventure content creator, the kind of guy who had built a following of like 40,000 people by filming himself doing increasingly extreme stuff and posting it with captions about pushing limits and trusting the process. Trail running, open water swimming, budget adventure travel across Europe and North Africa. The audience grew when he started climbing. Kilimanjaro got him 5,000 new followers in a week. Elbrus doubled his engagement. A guided ascent of Broad Peak the previous summer, where he turned back at Camp 3 due to weather, convinced him he belonged in the high-altitude world despite never having climbed terrain anywhere near as technical and unforgiving as K2. He talked about that Broad Peak attempt on his channel like it was a moral victory, proof that he could hang with the real climbers, and his audience ate it up, because they didn't know the difference between turning back at Camp 3 on Broad Peak and actually summiting anything in the death zone. K2 was not the logical next step. It was basically the content play that would separate him from every other adventure influencer filming the same three mountains. Everest was kinda oversaturated at that point. Everyone and their mother had Everest content. K2 was different, K2 was savage, K2 was the mountain that scared actual mountaineers, and nobody in the Portuguese fitness space had footage from it. He paid roughly $45,000 to join a small multinational expedition on the Abruzzi Spur, with limited fixed support and shared rope-fixing responsibilities between teams, funded partly by a Portuguese outdoor brand sponsorship built around the expectation of summit content. The footage wasn't technically required, but the entire deal was structured around it, and Vasco understood that coming home without it meant the sponsorship probably wouldn't continue. And honestly, that detail right there is what I keep coming back to, because it means the camera wasn't just a habit for this guy, it was tied to his income. And on K2, that distinction ends up mattering more than anything else in this story. His primarily assigned HAP for the summit push was Ghulam Sadiq, 33, from Hoosh Valley in Baltistan. 3K, 2 summits, quiet, efficient, The kind of HAP that expedition leaders assign to clients who needed watching. Not because he was patient with egos, but because he had a specific talent for reading when a client was about to make a decision that would get them killed. And so far, he'd been right every time. He'd turned clients around on Broad Peak, pulled one off G2 during a weather shift, and built a reputation that meant expedition leaders trusted his judgment sometimes more than they trusted their own. He had a wife and young son in Hush. K2 income funded his son's schooling in Skardu. 2 more seasons and tuition was covered. Ghulam's concern about Vasco started early. During the approach trek along the Baltoro, the 10-day walk from Oscole to base camps through some of the most remote terrain on Earth, he noticed that Vasco treated every rest stop as a filming opportunity. Every meal, every glacier crossing, every view of the mountain from a different angle became content. He filmed other climbers without asking. He filmed porters carrying loads and narrated over the footage as if he were hosting a documentary. It wasn't that filming was unusual on expeditions. Plenty of clients documented their climbs. But Vasco's whole relationship with the camera just felt different, like the experience wasn't real to him until it was recorded. Ghulam mentioned this to the expedition leader during the first week at base camp. The leader noted it and moved on. Acclimatization rotations began in early July after about a week of rest and preparation at base camp, cycling through camps 1, 2, and 3 on the Abruzzi Spur. The route climbed through increasingly hostile terrain, from the scree and snow slopes below Camp 1 to the steeper mixed climbing of the Black Pyramid between Camps 2 and 3, where fixed ropes threaded through rock chimneys and across ice-glazed ledges that required constant attention. Vasco performed adequately through all of it. Not elite, not struggling, middle of the pack among the commercial clients. His fitness carried him through the lower sections where cardiovascular capacity mattered most. Gym fitness and mountain fitness are 2 completely different things though, and the higher they went, the more obvious that gap was going to become. The technical terrain above Camp 2 exposed his limited mountaineering experience, but not dangerously so. The first real warning sign came during a rotation to Camp 2 at roughly 21,300 feet. On a section of exposed traverse where the route crossed a steep snow slope with a 1,000-foot drop below, Vasco stopped to film a time-lapse of cloud movement in the valley. Ghulam waited. Other climbers passed them. The time-lapse took 4 minutes. 4 minutes just standing there on a slope where you're supposed to keep moving, because rockfall from above pretty much funnels through that exact section every afternoon when the sun loosens debris. 4 minutes on an active rockfall slope for a time-lapse that would get maybe 3,000 views. That's the moment I knew where this story was going. The second warning came at Camp 3 around 24,600 feet. Vasco's oxygen consumption ran higher than expected because he kept removing his mask briefly to talk to camera, each time just 10 or 15 seconds. But those seconds kinda accumulated across hours of climbing, and the math showed up in his bottle pressure. Each removal caused his blood oxygen to drop pretty sharply, and afterward, he'd have to crank the regulator flow higher to recover, which basically drained the supply way faster than planned. Over a full day of climbing, those interruptions compounded in ways that showed clearly on the gauge. Ghulam noted this to the expedition leader, who spoke with Vasco directly. Vasco agreed to limit filming above Camp 3, but basically never followed through on that, which didn't surprise Ghulam at all. The summit window opened in the last week of July. Forecasts predicted 36 to 48 hours of manageable wind on the upper mountain, and multiple teams began moving upward simultaneously. They reached Camp 4 at roughly 25,000 feet on the shoulder, a broad exposed snow platform where wind hit from every direction, and the only thing between you and the sky was the summit pyramid above. Tents flapped violently even in moderate gusts. The cold at Camp 4 was a different species of cold than anything below. Sharper, more insistent. The kind that found you through 4 layers and punished any exposed surface within seconds. Vasco arrived tired, but functional. The summit push was planned for a midnight departure. I want to be clear about something before we get into summit day. Vasco wasn't incompetent. He was fit, he was motivated, and he had made it to Camp 4 on K2, which is further than most people will ever go. The problem wasn't ability, it was priority. His priority was footage, and on K2, that's the wrong priority to have. They departed Camp 4 around midnight on July 27th. Temperatures sat around -30 Fahrenheit before wind chill, the kind of cold that turned exposed skin white in minutes and made every metallic surface a contact hazard. The stars were visible for the first time in days, the Milky Way spilling across a sky so clear it looked artificial. Headlamps traced a line up the shoulder toward the bottleneck, a slow procession of light moving upward through darkness, each lamp representing a person who had paid and trained and suffered to be in one of the most dangerous places on Earth at 2 in the morning. Every K2 climber knows the bottleneck rule. The bottleneck is a steep couloir at roughly 26,000 to 27,000 feet, where a massive serac field, hundreds of feet tall and thousands of tons heavy, hangs directly above the climbing route. You move through as fast as possible. You never stop. The seracs above can calve without any warning at all, and when they do, they send thousands of tons of ice down the exact path climbers are standing on, and there is literally nowhere to go if you're in the way. The 2008 K2 disaster killed 11 people in that section. Everybody on the mountain in 2017 knew the history. Vasco filmed the approach to the bottleneck. Ghulam told him to put the camera away through this section. Vasco put it in his chest pocket, but pulled it out twice during the traverse for quick handheld shots, both times under 10 seconds. Both times noticed by Ghulam, who said nothing, because saying something in the bottleneck meant stopping in the bottleneck, which was worse than 10 seconds of footage. They cleared the bottleneck and the traverse above it by early morning, before the sun hit the seracs. This was correct timing. The schedule held, barely. Above the traverse, the route steepened toward the summit snowfield. Climbing was slow, exhausting. Every single step cost effort that the altitude made completely out of proportion to the distance gained, kinda like walking through knee-deep sand while breathing through a straw. Cloud built during the morning. Visibility dropped to roughly 100 to 150 feet. Not a whiteout, but enough to obscure the summit pyramid above. At approximately 28,050 feet, Vasco reached a rounded snow dome on the upper summit snowfield. In reduced visibility, with no reference points above, it looked and felt like the top. The ground sloped away in every direction he could see. He broke down. Emotional, elated, completely overwhelmed, he basically dropped to his knees in the snow and pulled his camera out and recorded like 2 minutes of fragmented celebration footage. Tears running down his face, mask pulled aside, thanking his followers between gasps, thanking his family, saying he did it. His voice broke multiple times and he had to pause to breathe between sentences, the altitude stripping his ability to speak in anything longer than short bursts. He turned the camera to show the panorama around him, cloud in every direction, the world falling away below. He transmitted a compressed still frame and a short text update through the expedition satellite device with a caption claiming the summit of K2. The image uploaded intermittently over the next hour through the SAT terminal back at Camp 4, and by the time it reached his followers, the comments were already building. Ghulam arrived at Vasco's position and immediately knew this was not the summit. When the cloud thinned briefly, the actual summit pyramid was still visible roughly 200 vertical feet above them. He told Vasco. Vasco did not accept it. He checked his altimeter, which at that altitude had significant margin of error due to pressure fluctuations. He looked around, turning in every direction, trying to find something higher. He argued with Ghulam, insisting the cloud was hiding nothing. Ghulam waited, then pointed upward as the cloud briefly thinned, and for a few seconds, the actual summit pyramid was unmistakably visible above them, a dark triangular shape still 200 vertical feet away. Vasco stared at it and said nothing for a long time. Then the realization hit. He had posted a summit claim that was wrong, and it was already out there. His sponsor had seen it. His followers had seen it. People were basically already congratulating him on a photo taken 200 feet below the actual summit of K2. Vasco decided to continue to the real summit. Ghulam objected. They were already behind the timeline. The celebration had burned more than 20 minutes of energy and oxygen they did not have to spare, and the weather window was narrowing, with cloud building from the west. Vasco insisted. Going home with a false summit claim posted to his entire following was not something he was willing to do. The correction would live on the internet forever. Every comment congratulating him would become evidence of his failure. In his mind, the only fix was the real summit. The ego math happening in his head at that altitude is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. He could have radioed base camp, corrected the post, taken the embarrassment, and descended alive. Instead, he chose the summit because the video was already out there, and admitting it was wrong felt worse than continuing into conditions his guide was telling him would kill him. Ghulam's options were to follow his client upward or abandon him alone above 27,000 feet. He followed. They pushed upward through deteriorating visibility. Vasco's pace had dropped noticeably, his oxygen consumption unsustainable, the false peak celebration having cost him reserves he could not get back. Each step was slower than the last, the altitude extracting more energy than his depleted body could generate. Ghulam stayed close, monitoring, calculating the timeline that was already broken. They reached the actual summit at around 11:40 a.m., which on K2 is pretty much dangerously late since most summit times aim for before 10 a.m. to give you enough time to get back down through the bottleneck before the midday sun starts loosening the Seracs above. Vasco knew this was his only chance to get clean summit footage, the footage his sponsor required, the footage that would correct the false peak image already circulating online, the footage that would make everything he had done over the past month mean something to the people watching. He unclipped from the fixed line. He pulled his oxygen mask down below his chin so his face was visible. He extended his arm and started filming himself on the summit of K2, face to camera, goggles pushed up, mask hanging around his neck, the Karakoram stretching out behind him in every direction. He unclipped from the fixed line on the summit of K2 and took his mask off for a video. I need you to understand what that means. K2 is not Everest. The summit ridge is narrower, more exposed, and the wind at that altitude can go from manageable to deadly between breaths. Unclipped with no mask means one gust away from gone. A wind gust caught him mid-sentence. He staggered sideways toward the edge, his body off balance from the extended arm holding the camera. His left glove, already loosened so he could operate the camera with his bare fingers, came off his hand and disappeared over the edge into the void. Bare skin at -30 with wind chill, which is basically instant damage. The hand immediately began to burn with a cold that felt like the opposite of fire. Ghulam grabbed him and got him back on the line, got his mask back on, wrapped his exposed hand in a spare buff, but the skin had already whitened almost immediately, and once frostbite takes hold at those temperatures, it doesn't stop progressing until you get to a hospital. Total time on the actual summit was roughly 8 minutes, most of it spent filming. They began descent at approximately 11:48 a.m., nearly 2 hours behind the safe schedule. The descent was slow from the start. Vasco was running on nothing, depleted from the false peak, the extra 200 feet of climbing, the unclip incident, his frostbitten hand losing function inside the wrapped buff, the fingers swelling and turning the color of old wax. His oxygen supply was critical, each breath draining a bottle that was already lower than it should have been at this point on the descent. Every step required concentration he was kinda running out of, and the altitude was just taking pieces of his coordination with each passing hour. They reached the traverse above the bottleneck in early afternoon. The sun had been hitting the Seracs for hours by this point. The ice above was groaning, audible even through wind and oxygen masks. Deep structural sounds that came from somewhere inside the ice mass and meant the frozen weight above was expanding and shifting as solar radiation warmed surfaces that were never meant to see this much heat. Small debris had already fallen across sections of the route below, chunks of ice the size of refrigerators just scattered across the couloir where climbers had been walking hours earlier. Other climbers ahead of them were moving through the danger zone quickly, exactly the way you're supposed to. Ghulam set the pace into the bottleneck, fast, controlled, no stopping for any reason. The couloir funneled them downward beneath the Serac wall, every second spent in its shadow. Another second the odds worked against them. Other teams moved with visible urgency, clipping past anchors with practiced speed. Nobody looking up, because looking up didn't help. The route was just littered with fresh debris, ice chunks from earlier calving events scattered across the path, like warnings nobody needed translated. You could pretty much see exactly what the Seracs were capable of, just by looking at the ground you were walking on. At approximately 26,500 feet, midway through the bottleneck, directly beneath the largest section of the Serac field, Vasco stopped. He pulled his camera out. He wanted to film the descent through the bottleneck, the Seracs visible above, the scale of where they were, the exposure. This was the shot, the one that would basically make the entire video, the massive wall of ice hanging over them while he narrated the descent, the kind of footage that gets millions of views because it looks insane and it is insane. Ghulam physically grabbed his arm and pulled. Vasco resisted. He said he needed 30 seconds. Ghulam told him they needed to move now, that the Seracs had been shedding debris all afternoon, and standing still in the bottleneck at 2 in the afternoon was basically not even a risk anymore. It was a guarantee. Vasco pulled his arm free and framed the shot. panning upward toward the Serac wall above them. 30 seconds. He just needed 30 seconds. I've covered a lot of last decisions on this channel, the kind people make at altitude when their judgment is gone. But this one is different because Vasco was almost certainly hypoxic, but not so impaired that he didn't understand the risk. He made a conscious choice to stand underneath a wall of unstable ice for content. And I genuinely don't know what to do with that. The sound came first, a deep crack that resonated through the couloir like a gunshot amplified by the ice walls. Then a roar that built faster than the brain could process it. Ice calved from the Serac band above the bottleneck. Not the entire face, that would have killed everyone on the route, but more than enough to destroy anything in its path. A massive slab of ice broke loose and triggered a cascade of debris straight down the couloir, accelerating as it fell, picking up more ice and snow as it went, directly over the section of route where Vasco was standing, with a camera pointed at the sky. Ghulam was roughly 15 feet ahead and below, partially sheltered by a rock rib on the edge of the couloir that provided just enough cover to deflect the main debris stream. The debris field hit the center of the bottleneck where Vasco was standing. The blast of ice and snow ripped him off his feet and sent him tumbling down the couloir. One surviving anchor finally arrested what was left of his fall after the sections above it had ripped free, leaving him partially buried in debris roughly 100 feet below where he had been standing. The camera was ripped from his hand and disappeared. Ghulam reached him within minutes. Vasco was conscious but pretty much catastrophically injured. Multiple fractures visible through his suit, his breathing wet, shallow, and uneven in a way that basically screamed chest trauma and internal bleeding. At 26,500 feet, with injuries like that, there is no rescue. There is no stretcher carry down a 60-degree couloir. Radio calls went down to Camp 4 almost immediately, but everyone on both ends understood the same reality. The math doesn't exist. He lost consciousness within 30 minutes. Ghulam stayed beside him the entire time, adjusting his mask, shielding his body from wind, talking to him, even after the responses stopped, doing the small things that don't change the outcome, but mean someone was there when it mattered. Other climbers passed on the fixed line. Some paused briefly, a few offered whatever they could carry, but at that altitude and in that location, nobody could stop for long without risking the same fate. Vasco stopped breathing shortly after. Ghulam stayed with him until he was certain, then descended through the lower bottleneck alone as the afternoon light turned the Seracs above, golden and unstable. He moved quickly, the way K2 demanded, not looking up, not looking back. Ghulam did everything right. He warned Vasco at every single point where a warning could have mattered. On the approach, in the bottleneck, at the false peak, at the summit, on the descent. Every time he was overruled by a 26-year-old with a camera and a contract. That's the part of this that stays with me the most. Vasco Noronha died in the bottleneck of K2 on July 27, 2017. He was 26 years old. The part that I keep getting stuck on is that he actually made it. He stood on the real summit of K2. He achieved the thing he came to achieve, and then he gave it all back, 30 seconds at a time, in a place where 30 seconds is the difference between walking home and not walking at all. His satellite-posted false summit image accumulated thousands of likes and comments before his expedition confirmed his death 2 days later. People were literally still posting congratulations under a photo taken on the wrong spot by a man who was already dead. Fragments of the camera and its storage card were recovered lower on the route by a team clearing debris weeks later. The last recoverable footage was a shaky panning shot of the Seracs above the bottleneck, the frame blurring, then nothing. Ghulam Sadiq sustained a fractured wrist and deep bruising from ice debris that caught the edge of his position behind the rock rib. The wrist healed improperly over the following months, the bone setting at an angle that limited his grip strength permanently and ended his ability to do the technical lead work that high-altitude guiding required. He could still carry loads at lower altitudes, but the earning potential that came with summit-level HAP work was gone. It wasn't a dramatic injury, it was the kind that just quietly takes your livelihood away while everyone else moves on. 3 summits, years of work, and his career ended because a client needed 30 seconds of footage in the one place on K2 where 30 seconds can kill you. He returned to Hoosh Valley and took work unrelated to expeditions. His son started school in Skardu that September on savings from seasons Ghulam would never repeat. The boy was 7 years old. The expedition company reviewed its protocols regarding client filming in hazard zones. No formal changes were made, The Portuguese brand that had sponsored Vasco's climb quietly removed his content from their channels within a week of the announcement and never publicly acknowledged the sponsorship again.
It was May 3, 2023. Lukla, Nepal. The moment Theron Holt stepped off the 9-seater turboprop at Tenzing Hillary Airport, he was already the loudest thing on the mountain. Theron Holt was 48 years old, 220 pounds, and had spent the better part of 2 decades as a financial executive on Wall Street. He was the kind of man who treated every room like a boardroom and every person in it like a subordinate. When he arrived in Lukla, Theron was equipped with brand new mountaineering gear and carried a summit certificate from Kilimanjaro, which he often cited as evidence of his climbing experience. He projected confidence and quickly assumed a leadership role within the group. His wife, Solveig, 46, had also purchased quality gear and researched the trek beforehand. She was generally cautious, but she tended to defer to Theron's decisions. By the time they reached Nepal, that dynamic was well established. She was already feeling unusually winded during the short walk from the Lukla airstrip, despite the town's relatively modest elevation of 9,383 feet. I want you to picture that situation. That is not even base camp. This is just where the trekking starts. Their daughter, Maren, was 17, 5'6", 120 pounds, with a small pack on her back and a blank expression that I kept coming back to when I went through the expedition records. She followed her father without being asked. She did not speak to the porters. She did not complain. She just existed in the space Theron had carved out for her and moved through the trip the way someone moves through something they did not choose. I found no record of her voicing any objection to the climb. I found no record of her voicing much of anything at all. The family's lead Sherpa, Pasang Dorje, was a veteran Everest guide with years of experience leading foreign climbers. From the start of the trek to base camp, he paid close attention to the Holt family and their condition at altitude. The route from Lukla to Everest Base Camp serves as both a trek and an acclimatization process, allowing climbers time to adapt to decreasing oxygen levels. Proper acclimatization is critical. Without it, the risk of serious altitude illness rises sharply. At Namche Bazaar, Pasang checked Solveig's blood oxygen saturation with a pulse oximeter. It read 82%, a low but not unusual value for someone recently arrived from sea level. Now, I think the real question is whether the number recovers after 2 days rest. Still, he noted that her recovery after rest was sluggish. After 48 hours at Namche, her numbers had barely improved, hovering in the low 80s. Pasang logged it and said nothing to the family yet. He was watching. Theron noticed none of this. He spent the 2 rest days at Namche eating enormous amounts of dalbat, posting updates to what I can only assume was a very engaged LinkedIn audience, and complaining loudly about the pace of the acclimatization schedule to anyone who would listen. At Dingboche, 14,469 feet, the itinerary called for a second scheduled rest day. Theron told Pasang they were skipping it. He had paid $45,000 for a summit attempt, and he was not going to spend an extra day at 14,000 feet doing nothing. Pasang walked him through the physiology. He explained patiently and in plain language what the rest day was actually doing for their bodies. Theron thanked him for the input and said they were moving up the next morning. Pasang said nothing more. He packed his kit. That was the first major red flag. I really wish it was the last, but we're just getting started. Maren started coughing at Lobusha, 16,207 feet. It was a dry, hollow cough, the kind that sounds like someone knocking on an empty wooden door. She was careful about it. Every time someone looked her way, she turned slightly and brought her hand to her mouth. She hid it the way teenagers hide things they know will cause a problem. Everest Base Camp sits at 17,598 feet beside the Khumbu Glacier. During the spring climbing season, it becomes a temporary city of tents, equipment, and support staff, as hundreds of climbers from around the world gather there to prepare for summit attempts. Before any Sherpa team begins climbing, they hold a puja ceremony, a Buddhist blessing performed by a lama that asks the mountain for safe passage. It is not optional. It is not a formality you can have perform. It is a ritual the Sherpa community takes seriously, and for good reason. These are the people who die on this mountain at a rate that is genuinely staggering. If you didn't know, a Sherpa guide is statistically about 10 times more likely to be killed on Everest than a foreign client. The ceremony matters to them in the way that things matter when your life depends on them. Theron did not remove his boots during the altar preparation. This was not ignorance. The guide service had sent a pre-expedition document that covered the puja ceremony in considerable detail. He just did not bother. He also checked his watch twice during the Lama's blessing.
I want you to sit with that for a moment. He checked his watch during a prayer being said for his own survival.
That night, after the ceremony, Pasang and his two other Sherpas, Tendi Norbu, 28, assigned primarily to the mother, and Lakpa Chairing, 41, the most experienced of the three, with 11 summits gathered outside the cook tent. They spoke in Nepali. Tendi said Solveig's fingernails had a faint blue tint to them, even while she was sitting still. Not during exertion at rest. Lakpa said Marin's cough did not sound like dryness or dust irritation. It sounded like something deeper, something fluid. Pasang tied a fresh kata scarf around his neck, a ceremonial Tibetan scarf, and said nothing.
There was nothing to say. They all knew what they were looking at.
The standard acclimatization strategy on Everest is called climb high, sleep low. You go up to stress the body at altitude, then come back down to let it adapt while you rest at a lower elevation. You do this in rotations, spending a night or two at progressively higher camps before returning to base camp and recovering before the actual summit push. The whole process takes weeks and cannot be meaningfully rushed. The Khumbu Icefall is the first major challenge above base camp and one of the most hazardous sections of the Everest route. This constantly shifting glacier is filled with deep crevasses and unstable ice towers that can collapse without warning. Climbers typically cross it before dawn to reduce exposure to warming temperatures, but even with fixed ladders and established routes, it remains an inherently dangerous environment.
Now, would you be surprised if I said Theron moved through it at near sprint?
He outpaced his Sherpa on the very first rotation, charging ahead on the fixed lines with the energy of a man who had no idea what the next 6 hours were going to cost him physically. He did not wait for ladder crossings to be confirmed stable before stepping onto them. At one point, he stepped over an open crevasse without clipping his harness into the fixed safety line, the one non-negotiable rule of the icefall, the rope that is the only thing between a climber and a fall, into a slot in the glacier. Tendi shouted at him from 30 feet back. Theron turned around and waved. 3 other climbers from a different team witnessed this and said nothing, which is its own kind of horror. At Camp 1, 19,500 feet, Pasang measured Solveig's blood oxygen saturation again. 78% borderline, but not yet catastrophic. To give that number some context, most people at that altitude will read in the low 80s. This was a clear warning, but not yet an emergency. Pasang told Solveig directly that she needed to monitor her symptoms closely. Solveig turned and looked at Theron. Theron said she was fine. Pasang told Solveig directly and clearly that she needed to descend back to base camp for 2 additional rest days. He said her body was not keeping up with the altitude gain, and that pushing further without proper adaptation would put her at serious risk. Solveig turned and looked at Theron. Theron said she was fine. Pasang repeated the recommendation a second time. Theron said he would be sure to include Pasang's reluctance in his post-expedition review.
Yep, you heard that right. He threatened his lead guide's professional reputation.
Threatened his livelihood, his access to future clients, his career, just to keep pushing his wife up a mountain that was slowly killing her. At Camp 2, 21,300 feet, Marin could not sleep. The expedition records from Pasang's journal note that she was sitting outside the tent at 2 in the morning, facing the Lhotse face, a 4,000-foot wall of blue ice that rises above the western CWM like a frozen skyscraper. She was coughing, and the cough had changed. It was wet now, with a sound like wringing out a sponge. She spat into the snow. No blood yet, but the fluid was thick and concerning. A wet cough at this altitude is never a good sign. By Camp 3, the cough had worsened. Marin pressed her jacket sleeve against her face and turned toward the tent wall. Pasang saw the sleeve later by headlamp. The fabric was damp, and when he held it close, he caught the faint iron smell of. That was the first real sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema HAPE, where the capillary walls in the lungs begin to leak fluid. If untreated, HAPE kills. Not slowly. It can go from concerning to fatal within a matter of hours. Marin had it at 23,000 feet, with more than 4,000 feet of climbing still ahead of her. She did not tell anyone. On the second rotation, the family was supposed to return to base camp before going higher. They did not. Theron had decided that staying high would build acclimatization faster. It does the opposite. The body recovers and adapts during rest at lower elevation, not while being continuously pushed upward. Pasang knew this. He called the base camp manager over the radio and laid out his concerns about the family's condition and their refusal to follow the acclimatization plan. The base camp manager told him the client was always right. Let me just pause on that. The person responsible for the safety logistics of this expedition, speaking to the lead guide, who was currently at 23,000 feet watching a 17-year-old bleed into her lungs, said the client was always right. Above Camp 2 on the Lhotse face, climbers ascend steep glacial ice using fixed ropes and mechanical ascenders. During one section of hard blue ice, Solveig stopped moving and clung to the rope, unable to continue while her crampons struggled to gain secure purchase on the surface. She stayed there for 22 minutes while the wind came off the face and the temperature hovered around minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere in those 22 minutes, she dropped her right glove. It tumbled off the Lhotse face and disappeared. Her bare fingers, in sub-zero temperatures, on a vertical wall of ice at nearly 24,000 feet, developed the white, waxy patches of early frostbite inside of 4 minutes. Pasang climbed down to her from above, removed one of his own spare gloves, and wrapped her hand. He told her they needed to go back down. Theron, watching from 50 feet above, said they would rest at Camp 3. That night, Marin's cough produced bright red blood for the first time, not just pink sputum, but distinct, alarming spots on her sleeve. She pressed her jacket against her face and turned toward the tent wall. The fabric was marked in 3 places. He said that he did not sleep that night. On day 10, bad weather kept all teams at Camp 2. Inside one tent, the Sherpa team discussed the worsening condition of the climbers they were monitoring. Lakpa reported that Solveig's heart rate was rising dramatically with minimal activity, suggesting her body was struggling to cope with the altitude. In his assessment, she was not fit to continue toward the summit. Tendi expressed similar concerns about Marin. Her symptoms, including a wet cough, now with visible blood, fatigue, and progressive deterioration with altitude, were consistent with high-altitude pulmonary edema or HAPE. He believed she needed immediate descent and possibly evacuation, as her condition was continuing to worsen.
And then Pasang said what they already knew, what you also probably knew. The father would refuse.
The guides agreed on a compromise. They would continue to Camp 4 at the South Col, roughly 26,000 feet, and reassess the family's condition there. Camp 4 lies within the death zone, where the human body can no longer acclimatize and begins to deteriorate. If Solveig or Marin showed any further inability to continue safely, the Sherpas planned to end the summit attempt and prioritize getting them back down the mountain. Pasang knew the father would argue. He also knew something worse, that by the time they reached the South Col, there might not be enough left of the mother or the daughter to argue with. Summit night began on May 16, with climbers leaving Camp 4 at around 10 p.m. in sub-zero temperatures and moderate winds. While conditions were considered acceptable for an ascent, the environment remained extremely hostile and dangerous. 12 climbers from several teams were heading for the summit that night. Under clear skies, a line of headlamps traced the southeast ridge as the climbers slowly ascended through the darkness above the Khumbu Valley. Theron led the rope team. He moved fast in the first hour, burning through glycogen and oxygen reserves that could not be replaced at that altitude. His mask kept fogging because he was breathing through his mouth, a bad habit that made the mask work against him and he never corrected it.
He strikes me as a man who didn't correct things when people pointed them out, and that reluctance came from pride.
Behind him, Solveig fell back within the first 90 minutes. Her frostbitten right hand could not grip the mechanical ascender that she needed to clip along the fixed lines. She was working entirely with her left hand, which slowed her to a grinding pace. Tendi stayed with her a few paces back, matching her speed and watching every placement of her crampon on the ice. Near the balcony, at about 27,500 feet, Marin's condition turned critical. She had been moving slowly behind her mother, and then she accelerated without warning. She pushed past Solveig and caught up to her father. Her cough was constant now, not occasional, not something she could hide in the darkness, and she left small, dark spots on the ice crystals behind her. The spots were blood. She was bleeding into her own airway, and she was still climbing. I think about that a lot. A 17-year-old girl, bleeding from her lungs at 27,000 feet in the middle of the night, just following her father up a mountain because that was what she had always done. Theron reached the balcony, a ledge at about 27,500 feet, where climbers often pause before the final push. While taking a break, he removed his oxygen mask and encountered problems reconnecting it after the system partially froze in the extreme cold. Pasang eventually fixed the issue, but during the delay he noticed signs that concerned him. Theron appeared unusually slow to respond, his hands were shaking, and his appearance suggested he had been affected by a period of reduced oxygen exposure at extreme altitude. Pasang pointed down. Theron shook his head and pointed up. Marn arrived minutes later. She was hyperventilating fast, shallow breaths that were not delivering oxygen efficiently because her lungs were filling from the inside. And then she coughed, and a visible spray of blood hit the interior of her oxygen mask. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wiped the inside of the mask with her glove and adjusted the seal against her face. Pasang grabbed her arm. He pointed at the mask, then at her chest, then down the mountain. He was as clear as language could be without words.
And one of the most breathtaking parts in this story for me was this.
Maren looked at her father, who was already moving upward. She just followed him. Above the balcony, near the south summit, Solveig suddenly became unable to move normally. She stumbled, struggled to coordinate her movements, and repeatedly failed simple tasks, all signs consistent with severe altitude illness. Recognizing the symptoms, Tendi concluded she was likely developing high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, a life-threatening condition caused by swelling of the brain at extreme altitude. He radioed Pasang, who instructed him to begin an immediate descent. Tendi turned around with Solveig, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. After only a few steps, she collapsed against the fixed line and could no longer continue on her own. He attempted to lower her using a rope system, but the terrain and her condition made progress extremely difficult, eventually forcing him to stop beside her on the slope. Her pulse was faint and irregular. Her pupils were unequal. One was blown wide in the darkness, which, under those conditions, meant one thing. Her breathing was slow and spaced out. She stopped breathing 47 minutes after she collapsed. Tendi pushed a broken ice axe, blade first, into the snow above her and marked the location. There was no evacuation possible. There was no helicopter coming, no rescue team on its way up the southeast ridge.
Solveig Holt died at 28,300 feet, and her body is still there.
And at less than 1,000 feet from the summit, Maren stopped. It was not a gradual slowdown. Her legs stopped working, and she sat down in the snow the way a building sits down during a controlled demolition, suddenly and completely. Her breathing, which had been wet and audible for hours, had changed. It was gurgling, the sound of air moving through liquid.
You have to understand that this is the clinical presentation of a lung that has lost the ability to function as a lung.
And at 28,500 feet, with no surgical team, no IV diuretics, and no way down fast enough to matter, it means the end is very close. Pasang reached her and tried to lift her. 120 pounds at sea level is nothing. At 28,500 feet, after 9 hours of climbing, with his own supplemental oxygen running low, and his legs already past the point of normal exhaustion, it might as well have been 400. He could not carry her. He called base camp on the radio and told them Maren's condition. The expedition manager, at a comfortable altitude in a heated tent, told Pasang to descend with the father. The daughter was beyond help. Theron heard that transmission. He turned and grabbed Pasang's jacket and pointed up the mountain. His wife was dying on the slope below him. His daughter was sitting in the snow with blood freezing on the inside of her oxygen mask.
And he pointed up. How cruel is that?
Her eyes were open and aimed at the sky above the south summit. Her coughing had stopped, not because anything had improved, but because the mechanism that was doing the coughing had stopped working. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular waves, with long pauses between them. Maren Holt died on the southeast ridge of Everest at 28,500 feet. She was 17 years old. She had not chosen to be there. Theron kept climbing.
I have read through a significant number of expedition accounts from guides and climbers on that mountain.
And the thing about this one that stays with me is that Theron Holt knew his wife was dying somewhere below him and had watched his daughter sit down and stop moving, and he kept going up. Whether that was a rational choice at that point is a real question. At 28,000 feet, with no supplemental oxygen and a brain running on fumes, the higher cognitive functions, the ones that evaluate risk, weigh consequences, and allow you to decide not to do something are the first to go. It is possible Theron did not fully understand what he had just seen. It is also possible he understood completely and could not stop. Pasang followed him because he could not leave a client who was still moving. That is the position guides are put in, and it is an impossible one. You cannot physically restrain an adult. You cannot force someone off a mountain. You bear responsibility for them and have almost no actual authority over them, and if you abandon them, the liability falls on you.
And so Pasang followed Theron up toward what used to be called the Hillary Step.
Near the Hillary Step, climbers encountered a bottleneck while teams worked to clear and reestablish the fixed route through newly accumulated snow. Rather than wait, Theron attempted to climb around the queue on unprotected terrain and slipped on hard ice. He fell a short distance before a backup anchor stopped him. During the fall, his oxygen cylinder was torn loose and lost down the mountainside. Pasang descended to assist him and reconnect him to the fixed line. After assessing the situation, he determined that Theron's loss of supplemental oxygen at nearly 29,000 feet had created a serious emergency. With limited spare oxygen available among nearby teams, reaching the summit was no longer realistic, and the priority became getting him safely back down the mountain. He tried to redirect Theron toward the descent. Theron resisted. For 20 minutes at 29,000 feet, they struggled. Not a physical fight in the traditional sense, but two people in full mountaineering gear at the edge of the functional limit of human altitude, pulling against each other's purpose. Every movement at that elevation costs something that cannot be replaced. 20 minutes of that kind of effort, without oxygen.
Think about that. That's not a setback. That's burning whatever Theron had left. And he had almost nothing to begin with.
And then he sat down. Not deliberately. He sat down the way a machine powers off. His head dropped forward and then corrected slowly, like a person falling asleep. Pasang tried to lift him 150 pounds of exhausted Sherpa against 220 pounds of unconscious man. He moved Theron 10 feet. Then Theron's eyes opened. They fixed on a point somewhere above Pasang's head, and then they stopped moving. Pasang took a small prayer flag from the inside pocket of his down suit, a printed square of colored cloth about the size of a paperback book, and placed it over Theron's face. Then he turned around and started down. Tendi came down from the south summit alone. He passed the spot where Solveig had died, marked by the ice axe blade, catching the early morning light as the sky began to brighten behind Lhotse. He passed the place on the slope where Maren had sat down. She was curled on her side now, her fingers locked around the zipper of her own jacket in the last thing she had tried to do, the oxygen tank on her back reading empty. Her face mask dark with frozen blood. She had been dead for approximately 2 hours. He could not carry her. No one could have. The Holt family's relatives back in the United States had filed a formal complaint by email, alleging that the Sherpa guides had failed to adequately warn the family of the risks involved. The complaint had been submitted 3 days after the scheduled summit date, when no word had come from the mountain. Pasang looked at the manager for a moment. Then he went to his tent. A formal inquiry was opened by the expedition company. They submitted the complete radio logs, Pasang's written acclimatization plan with its declined recommendations, the base camp manager's recorded transmissions, including the one where he told Pasang the client was always right, and Tendi's documented record of Solveig's oxygen saturation readings going back to Namche. Bizarre. The complaint was dismissed. The guide service did not renew its contract with the base camp manager. The bodies of Theron, Solveig, and Maren Holt remain on the southeast ridge of Everest, where they will remain indefinitely. Pasang returned to Fortse to his 2 children and his elderly mother. He has not guided a climbing expedition since.
I can't help but feel that the mountain didn't break the father's arrogance. It just made an innocent guide carry the weight of it forever.
On May 19, 2016, Camp 4 on Mount Everest sat above 26,000 feet in the death zone, where temperatures had dropped to minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, and climbers moved into the dark on fixed ropes toward the summit. Lowell DeVries, 52, was a commercial real estate developer from Austin, Texas. Diane DeVries, 49, co-owned a residential design studio. They had been married for 22 years and had gradually built a shared pattern of doing difficult structured objectives together. They had limited high-altitude experience, Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and a weather-forced retreat on Denali. That Denali turnaround stayed with Lowell more than expected. It was the first widely visible objective in years that did not end in completion. They later committed to Everest. The expedition cost approximately $570,000 and included guided support, staged oxygen systems, Sherpa assistance, and a fixed summit plan. By early 2016, the climb was publicly announced through Austin business media and sponsor-linked charity coverage, turning a private goal into something externally visible and tracked. The 2016 Everest season presented additional constraints. It was the first full reopening after the 2015 Nepal earthquake, leading to a backlog of expeditions. Teams were concentrated into a narrow summit window, a period of meteorological stability essential for a safe ascent. This window was shaped by unstable jet stream patterns and cyclone-driven weather systems, making precise forecasting critical. The convergence of multiple expeditions into this limited time frame created logistical challenges and increased traffic on the fixed lines, potentially impacting ascent rates and safety margins. The De Vries completed standard rotations between base camp and higher camps, building altitude tolerance step by step. It's a slow process, and it doesn't guarantee anything. They progressed from base camp to Camp 1, then a carry to Camp 2, and a rotation to Camp 3 without incident. Neither client needed to be evacuated or hit any medical cutoff that would have forced them off the climb. During the Camp 2 rotation, Diane developed a lingering dry cough, what climbers usually call the Khumbu cough. It's pretty common up there, but it can also be an early warning sign that the lungs are under strain, including more serious issues like HAPE. The expedition doctor kept an eye on it, but it never got bad enough to step her down or stop the rotation. It stayed with her through Camp 3 and was later mentioned to the base camp medical team. This observation, while not critical at the time, represented a subtle physiological signal that could become significant under greater duress. During the Camp 3 rotation, Lowell's resting blood oxygen saturation measured 58%. Lowell's oxygen saturation was 58%, above the intervention threshold, but close enough to matter in context. On paper, it's fine. On Everest, fine isn't always enough. The guide's expedition log recorded both climbers moving significantly below target pace, above 24,000 feet. This indicated a shortfall in physical efficiency that was not communicated to the clients, limiting their understanding of what the summit bid actually required. Between May 14th and May 17th, the De Vries remained at base camp, under enforced rest and observation, while other teams moved through a brief earlier summit window. 2 guided expeditions reached the summit on May 15th and May 16th, and their photographs quickly circulated through base camp. Seeing others achieve the objective while they remained below created a growing psychological pressure and a quiet sense of urgency, one that was not fully aligned with weather forecasts or physiological readiness. That kind of thing sticks with people more than they expect, seeing others already on the summit when you're still waiting below. On May 17th, the guide presented the expedition meteorologist's forecasts to the De Vries. The May 19th to 20th window was identified as the best available option before Cyclone Roanu influenced. Deterioration closed the season for serious attempts. The meteorologist's analysis, based on satellite imagery, atmospheric pressure readings, and wind speed predictions, indicated a brief period of relative stability. This timing was critical to ensure sufficient daylight for the most technical sections and to avoid the increased wind speeds typically associated with midday. Continued progress to the South Summit was planned, with a final summit arrival by 11 a.m. at the absolute latest. The parameters for the summit push were outlined with a strict timeline: departure from Camp 4 on the evening of May 19th, aiming for the balcony by 3:30 a.m., the South Summit by late morning, and a final turnaround before 11 a.m. to allow descent before the weather window closed around 3 p.m. The plan left minimal margin for delay, but was considered feasible under optimal conditions. Lowell agreed to the plan without extended deliberation, his decision likely influenced by the perceived urgency and the public nature of their endeavor. Diane, consistent with their established dynamic, did not separate her decision from his, following his lead as she had in every prior objective framed as a joint accomplishment. Camp 4 sat above 26,000 feet, inside the death zone. Time spent here was already counted in physiological loss, not comfort. By this point, the body isn't adapting anymore. It's just holding on. In the final hours before the summit push, the De Vries rested in their tent, conserving energy. They checked oxygen systems, regulators, and bottles. Gloves and layering systems were inspected for integrity. They consumed what food they could, understanding the critical need for caloric intake, even with diminished appetite at altitude. Later that night, under darkness, they clipped onto the fixed line and began their upward movement. The initial 1,500 vertical feet above Camp 4, encompassing the triangular face, is a steep and physically demanding section. However, it is considered lower on the mountain's overall difficulty scale compared to the more technical terrain that follows. The guide saw both of them moving through this section at a steady, almost machine-like pace, the kind you only get on long nights when climbers are just putting one foot in front of the other. It was around -24 degrees Fahrenheit at the start, brutally cold, but still something they could work in. The wind was steady enough to be noticeable, but not strong enough to really throw them off or make every step a fight, which mattered for keeping their footing and avoiding frostbite. Oxygen was flowing at a rate of 2 liters per minute, a conservative setting designed to preserve the reserve supply for the critical descent phase. Lowell moved methodically, his movements deliberate and controlled. Diane maintained his pace through the early hours, demonstrating a consistent rhythm. The guide, positioned behind and slightly above them in rotation, allowed himself a cautious internal assessment. The pace was acceptable, the conditions were within operational limits, and the overall attempt appeared viable. The team successfully reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, approximately 15 minutes behind their predetermined schedule. At the balcony, the guide performed a critical mental calculation, later documented in the expedition incident report. To summit and return to Camp 4 before the weather window closed, the team needed to maintain or slightly improve their ascent rate. The guide's extensive experience in extreme altitude environments had taught him a fundamental principle. Pace at such elevations does not improve. It invariably degrades as fatigue accumulates and physiological stress intensifies. He noted this critical discrepancy internally, recognizing the inherent risk, but chose not to act on it immediately, perhaps hoping for an improvement in conditions or climber performance. While at the balcony, in the profound darkness of the pre-dawn hours, Diane removed her outer glove to adjust her oxygen mask strap. This minor mechanical correction at sea level would take 2 to 3 seconds. However, at 27,600 feet, in ambient temperatures of -24 degrees Fahrenheit, and with wind speeds of 22 miles per hour, her bare hand was exposed to extreme cold for approximately 40 seconds before the glove was replaced. The guide observed this action. He noted that her fingers appeared cold but still functional, indicating that immediate frostbite had not occurred. But the risk was elevated. He did not verbally intervene. He would later document this specific incident in his formal incident report as the first observable sign of manual dexterity degradation, a critical clinical indicator at extreme altitude where fine motor skills are among the first to be compromised due to hypoxia and cold. Above the balcony, the terrain changes significantly. Fixed lines traverse increasingly iced and exposed rock sections toward the south summit. This segment demands deliberate and precise foot placement, constant vigilance regarding crampon contact with ice and rock, and motor precision inversely proportional to diminishing oxygen availability. This is where speed variations become operationally significant. Any delay, due to reduced pace or technical difficulty, compounds into the broader time calculation, jeopardizing the entire summit bid. Lowell's pace above the balcony led the guide to estimate their likely summit timing based on how fast they were actually moving. He figured they would reach the summit late in the morning, or closer to midday, with a chance it could slip later if their pace continued to slow. Working backward from that, it meant their descent from the upper mountain would likely push into the early evening at the earliest, depending on how many stops they needed and how conditions held. This is where plans on paper and reality on the mountain quietly stop matching each other. This directly conflicted with the weather window, projected to close in the mid-afternoon. By that stage of the day, climbers were supposed to be descending from the summit, not still pushing toward it. The deficit between normal summit timing and their actual pace was now measured in hours, not minutes. This was in conditions forecast to become actively dangerous after the weather window closed, with increasing winds and deteriorating visibility. Despite this critical assessment, the guide continued to observe and climb, maintaining his position behind the clients. Near the approach to the south summit, the guide stopped the team. A critical exchange followed, communicated not verbally, but through pre-agreed signals established during training at Camp 4. The guide clearly indicated their pace was insufficient. The summit bid no longer viable within safe parameters, and his professional recommendation was to initiate a descent. He signaled the critical time constraint, the significant pace deficit, and the unequivocal direction of retreat. At this juncture, the guide's recommendation transcended mere information. It became a direct, directional instruction, a request to abandon the objective for safety reasons. Lowell processed this information without visible hesitation. Lowell responded by shaking his head once, a clear refusal, and then pointed upward, indicating his unwavering intent to continue toward the summit. The guide, understanding the gravity, signaled again. He reiterated the time constraint, emphasizing the rapidly closing weather window. He re-indicated the pace differential, highlighting the growing gap between their actual progress and the required speed. And he clearly signaled for them to turn around. Lowell shook his head and pointed upward again. He didn't look at Diane, didn't pause, and gave no sign he was weighing the warning in real time. He just committed to the push. Then he turned and started moving upward again, continuing the climb. This is usually the moment where things stop being about the mountain and start being about the decision to keep going anyway. The guide, operating within his professional contract, did not possess the legal authority to compel a descent. His contract permitted him to descend independently if necessary for his own personal safety, absolving him of responsibility for the client's continued ascent. However, he did not exercise this option. Instead, he made the decision to follow his clients upward, a choice with profound consequences. The two Sherpa porters, positioned slightly below the main climbing party, exchanged a brief, unspoken look, a silent acknowledgement of the unfolding situation that neither client observed. They too followed, continuing their ascent behind the guide. At this point, oxygen reserve calculations became the primary constraint on all decisions. From the moment Lowell pointed upward, every subsequent action was shaped by the remaining oxygen supply and its limitations. The team was operating under a finite resource, with each minute of continued ascent reducing the available margin for descent. At the south summit, both Lowell and Diane arrived and stopped. Diane, exhibiting profound fatigue and possibly early cerebral hypoxia, sat down without instruction and remained seated for 8 minutes. At this extreme altitude, prolonged static rest is a significant warning sign. The human body struggles to maintain core temperature without continuous movement, and heat production drops rapidly. Reduced oxygen to the brain affects the neurological drive to initiate movement, making stillness feel normal, even as conditions worsen. Diane remained seated, her oxygen system functioning, eyes open, indicating she was not unconscious. She eventually, with apparent effort, stood and continued her ascent. The guide then took the lead, setting the pace toward the Hillary Step and the final ridge. From other cases, resting at that altitude has a different meaning. Lowell DeVries reached the summit of Mount Everest on May 20th, 2016. He was the first team member to stand at the top, a culmination of years of training and significant financial investment. He had climbed through the night and morning, enduring extreme temperatures and increasing winds. He reached the highest point on Earth in the late morning. Diane arrived shortly after noon, approximately 14 minutes later. Both clients stood at the summit, briefly but long enough for the objective to be formally completed and documented. From a distance, this is the success moment. From inside the climb, it's already the beginning of the way down. Neither client's face is clearly visible in any of the summit images, likely due to oxygen masks, goggles, and hoods. However, the photographs unequivocally confirm the summit, the distinctive geometry of the ridge, the visible curvature of the horizon, and the position of the Tibetan Plateau visible to the north. They are summit photographs in every documentable sense, providing irrefutable evidence of their achievement. The guide initiated the descent shortly after their arrival at the summit, without ceremony or extended celebration. He immediately set a brisk downward pace, acutely aware of the rapidly closing weather window, projected to shut in less than 3 hours. The team faced approximately 8,800 vertical feet of highly technical terrain to descend, in conditions already shifting, with increasing wind and potential for deteriorating visibility. He understood the immense physical and mental demands the next 6 hours would impose. The descent was noticeably slower than the climb up, which is normal at that altitude. Going down is harder in a different way. Your legs are more fatigued and every step takes more control. You're also dealing with gear like Jumars and Descenders, which require steady hands and focus, both of which get worse in the cold and thin air. Still, what the guide was seeing was beyond what he would normally expect, even for a slow descent at that height. Above the Hillary step, Diane's footwork became noticeably unsteady. While she did not fall, her Jumar clipped correctly. Her movements lacked deliberate precision. Her feet dragged slightly, indicating loss of fine motor control and coordination. She was not accurately reading the rock and ice contours, suggesting cognitive impairment. In response, the guide increased her oxygen flow from 2 liters per minute to 4 liters per minute. This adjustment, while providing a temporary physiological boost, had immediate and unfavorable reserve consequences. The higher flow rate would exhaust her primary summit bottle significantly faster, bringing forward the critical moment when the team would become entirely dependent on backup reserves, thereby shortening their operational window. At the south summit during descent, Lowell stopped for an unscheduled 12-minute rest. This pause at a critical juncture, combined with worsening weather, raised concern. Winds were sustained at 34 miles per hour, with gusts up to 44 miles per hour, and temperatures at 31 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. The weather window was closing faster than forecast, indicating rapid deterioration. The guide, acutely aware of these converging factors, did not rest. He remained vigilant, constantly monitoring the ridge for changes in terrain, scanning the sky for signs of worsening weather, and meticulously tracking the dwindling time. Below the south summit, on the descent toward the balcony, Diane collapsed to her knees on the fixed line. Her Jumar caught her, preventing a fall, but she was unable to stand up under her own power. This indicated severe loss of muscular strength and coordination, likely exacerbated by extreme fatigue and hypoxia. A Sherpa porter immediately moved to her side and physically lifted her back to a standing position. She remained oriented but lacked the physical capacity to generate the necessary upward force. Recognizing her severe condition, the Sherpa clipped his harness to hers and initiated a physical assist descent, providing continuous supplemental force. At this point, the climb is no longer about progress. It's about whether the body can still respond at all. Lowell, approximately 30 feet below, did not fully register the gravity of the situation, preoccupied with his own precarious movement, a testament to tunnel vision under extreme stress and hypoxia. He continued his descent, unaware of Diane's full incapacitation. The guide, observing, made a critical assessment. He had one client in a full physical assist descent, requiring constant Sherpa support, and another struggling. The guide was the third operational member. Diane's primary summit oxygen bottle emptied, forcing a switch to her backup. Lowell's backup bottle read only 40% capacity. The combined remaining oxygen supply had a calculable, rapidly approaching endpoint. At current flow rates and accounting for Diane's physical assist descent, the mathematical projection resolved to an operational window of mere hours, demonstrably shorter than the estimated time to reach Camp 4 at their degraded pace. The guide determined that continuing the assisted descent in 58-mile-per-hour wind gusts, coupled with Diane's compromised mobility, presented an unacceptable fall risk. He identified a marginal depression in the ridge at 28,400 feet, offering minimal wind reduction. He made the difficult decision to stop the team there. From there, he radioed base camp with their exact location, along with an update on Diane's condition and how low their oxygen supply was getting. Base camp acknowledged the call. A helicopter evacuation was considered, but with the altitude above 23,000 feet and the wind conditions at that level, a night extraction wasn't possible, leaving the team stuck where they were. In a follow-up transmission, the guide provided details on the dire oxygen situation and the balcony cache below. Faced with remaining or retrieving supplies, he decided to descend alone for an oxygen bottle. He left the two Sherpa porters with the De Vries at 28,400 feet, instructing them to provide comfort. He reached the balcony cache, secured the bottle, and began the arduous return ascent. Approximately 300 feet above the balcony, he could not continue upward. Wind gusts were now hitting hard enough to repeatedly knock him sideways during upward movement, and spindrift was stripping visibility off the fixed line. He made several attempts, but it proved impossible. He transmitted this critical update to base camp later that evening. He then made the agonizing decision to descend to Camp 4, arriving about an hour and a half later, physically and emotionally spent. Meanwhile, the two Sherpa porters at 28,400 feet maintained intermittent radio contact with Camp 4. Transmissions were disrupted by wind, but consistent enough to track the situation. One Sherpa reported Lowell sitting against the fixed line anchor, unresponsive to prompting, indicating severe decline in consciousness. In a subsequent update, the same porter reported Diane breathing but unrousable, suggesting deepening unconsciousness or coma. Further transmission confirmed both clients unresponsive, a definitive sign of critical physiological failure. Shortly after, the functional radio porter reported his own condition rapidly deteriorating due to hypothermia and exhaustion. He began a solo descent, his radio failing soon after. The other Sherpa remained. By the time communications ceased, base camp logged definitive loss of radio contact from 28,400 feet. Once communication starts breaking down up there, everything becomes smaller and more local. Just the next few meters, not the outcome. At first light on May 21st, a two-person Sherpa recovery team left Camp 4 early in the morning. They were equipped with supplemental oxygen, hot fluids, and emergency thermal supplies. They climbed through conditions that had moderated but not normalized, winds still above 30 miles per hour at the upper ridge, temperature well below zero. They reached the position at 28,400 feet approximately 4 hours after departing Camp 4. Lowell DeVries and Diane DeVries were both deceased. They were found in a partially seated, partially slumped position against the fixed line anchor, precisely where they had ceased voluntary movement. Both oxygen backup bottles were fully exhausted. Diane's left hand was ungloved, either removed during terminal cold confusion or taken by wind. Lowell's oxygen mask was partially displaced, indicating a possible struggle or loss of consciousness. There was no evidence of falls, equipment malfunctions, or external injury. The position was consistent with individuals who had ceased voluntary movement and succumbed to extreme conditions. The Sherpa porter who had remained was found alive, severely hypothermic and non-communicative. He was assisted down to Camp 4 and evacuated, receiving extensive medical treatment in Kathmandu for hypothermia and frostbite, and ultimately survived. The bodies of Lowell and Diane DeVries remained at 28,400 feet for 4 days. A recovery operation coordinated between the guiding company, Nepalese climbing authorities, and a specialist Sherpa team required a secondary weather window and 12 additional personnel to execute safely. The couple was brought to base camp on May 25th, airlifted to Kathmandu, and repatriated to Austin, Texas. The costs of the recovery operation were covered by an insurance clause included in the original expedition package, a provision the DeVries had paid for as part of the $570,000 agreement. Post-mortem examination conducted in Kathmandu, with supplementary pathology review completed in Austin, identified the primary cause of death for both individuals as high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition in which the brain swells in response to prolonged insufficient oxygen at extreme elevation, progressively degrading coordination, judgment, and consciousness before producing irreversible neurological damage and death. Secondary contributing factors listed in the documentation were hypothermia and a hypoxic cardiac event in Lowell's case. No traumatic injuries were found on either body. The medical examiner's documentation noted that high-altitude cerebral edema at extreme elevation is clinically indistinguishable from ordinary exhaustion until the point at which motor and cognitive function have already been compromised beyond the threshold of self-rescue. Both individuals died at the location where their movement stopped. The guiding company's internal incident report, reviewed by Nepalese climbing authorities as part of a standard post-fatality investigation, recorded the guide's turnaround recommendation and the client's decision to continue. It concluded that the guide followed established protocol at every decision point available to him. No regulatory action was taken against any party. The $41,000 raised in the Austin charity auction, pledged against a verified summit, was donated in full by the co-sponsoring firms, without condition, after the deaths were confirmed. The disbursement clause had required a summit. There had been one. The money was released.
It was May 28, 2016, near the peak of Denali's climbing season, when guided expeditions were moving steadily onto the mountain during one of the year's most active weather windows. The woman who met them was Kara Harmon, legally born Carolyn Bexley. She was 34 years old, and she had already been pushed out of the formal guiding world years earlier after a pattern of professional and ethical violations that made her unfit for certification or partnership within regulated alpine guiding systems. She failed the main professional mountain guiding certification evaluations twice, including core assessments in rope management, terrain judgment, and client safety decision-making, and later attempted to reapply using altered personal details, which resulted in her applications being flagged and rejected.
I've noticed reputations like that don't really need a final ban or anything official. People just quietly stop picking up your calls, stop teaming up with you, and before long you're basically outside the system without anyone ever making a big announcement about it.
What followed wasn't one clear expulsion, more like a slow shutdown of access. In regional guiding circles, she built a reputation for misrepresenting qualifications and making questionable calls in changing conditions, poor descent timing, clients ending up exposed to avoidable risk. It didn't always turn into legal action, but it didn't really need to. Experienced guides and operators just stopped working with her, one by one, until there wasn't really anywhere left to plug back into. By the time she reappeared under the name Kara Harmon, she was no longer part of any legitimate guiding structure. She had built an independent operation that relied on fabricated certifications and a professional facade designed to resemble licensed guiding services, despite lacking any valid authorization. Her exclusion from the professional system was not symbolic, it was functional. She had been denied certification, refused recognition, and effectively barred from legitimate guiding pathways due to repeated misrepresentation and safety concerns, yet she continued operating in the same terrain regardless. The 19 clients were distributed across rope teams under Bexley's coordination, with 4 junior guides unevenly positioned within the system. Later investigation confirmed that none possessed the certifications or experience expected for a commercial Denali expedition. He was 41, a structural engineer for a civil contracting firm in Tacoma, married, 2 kids, and someone who'd spent years hiking the North Cascades and the Olympics. On paper, he did everything right, maybe even more than most people would, but none of that really replaces time actually moving through glaciated terrain. No rope team travel, no crampon work on ice, none of that. You only really learn it when you're there, experience.
He reads like someone who did everything you're supposed to do before a trip like this, but I don't really think any of that translates to having been in that kind of terrain before.
The Denali expedition was a delayed 40th birthday goal, booked through what he believed was a licensed guiding service on an outdoor activity platform. He paid $1,800. 4 coworkers joined him at the same rate. None had prior glaciated climbing experience. By all accounts, Osmond prepared carefully. He completed a 1-day crampon clinic 6 weeks prior, purchased appropriate technical gear, and repeatedly reviewed provided checklists and instructional materials. His wife later described a methodical approach, guidebooks, training videos, and multiple clarification calls to the booking service, each met with procedural reassurance. He had done everything the listing instructed.
And I think that's the part that always sticks with me. He followed the checklist exactly the way most people would. And there's a kind of trust in that that feels completely reasonable until you realize the checklist isn't the mountain.
That fact would later be treated not as a detail, but as a structural failure, the gap between procedural compliance and actual mountain competence. A second group of 7 participants came through a now defunct Facebook hiking community in the Seattle area. Their ages ranged from mid-20s to mid-50s and reflected a broad mix of professions including healthcare, education, retail, and logistics. One retired postal worker from Federal Way 64 described the climb as a long-considered milestone. Communication with the guide occurred entirely through text and a single brief group video call. A third group of 7 was assembled through a corporate wellness program at a mid-sized insurance firm in Bellevue. The company contracted what it believed was a licensed and insured commercial guiding operation for a team-building expedition. None had technical climbing experience beyond recreational indoor activity. 19 people, 3 different booking paths, and one guide operating under a maid identity, no valid credentials, and no actual authorization to lead a glaciated ascent like that. In the parking area that evening, Bexley distributed a single-page safety briefing adapted from unrelated Pacific Northwest climbing materials and not fully revised for the expedition. It included references to non-existent or misattributed landmarks, such as Fumarole Flat and Hot Rocks Camp, carried over from Mount St. Helens materials. None of the 19 clients identified the errors.
I don't really blame them for missing it. In that kind of setting, most people assume the paperwork has already been checked by someone who knows what they're doing.
She also issued self-drafted liability waivers that had not been reviewed by legal counsel and contained provisions unlikely to be enforceable under standard commercial guiding regulations. Clients signed without scrutiny, treating the process as routine intake. One participant, Marcus Stull, noted the group size discrepancy, 19 instead of the expected 8. Bexley attributed it to merged bookings and assured the route could accommodate larger spacing. Stull did not escalate the concern. Another client, Trevor Nast, requested credentials. Bexley presented a laminated AMGA-style card under the name Kara Harmon, which Nast photographed but did not verify. It was later determined to be counterfeit. Some of them did question it, at least briefly. The group size felt off, the paperwork didn't really line up, and a few people asked direct questions about credentials. But every time it came up, she brushed it off quickly, talked over it, leaned on the laminated card, kept repeating that everything was properly licensed and standard for bigger alpine groups, and when someone hesitated, it usually ended the same way. The conversation just moved on before it had a chance to turn into a real decision point. Gerald Fenwick disclosed a recent minor cardiac event and hypertension, but stated he had medical clearance. No documentation was collected, and no formal medical screening was conducted. Gear checks were completed through visual inspection, confirming required equipment. Waivers were collected and retained. Departure was scheduled for the following morning, following air transport onto the glacier. That night, weather conditions at valley level were calm. Some participants reviewed generally favorable forecasts, though limited detail was available for high elevation conditions. Others contacted family or posted preparatory updates. After the staging area cleared out, Bexley looked over a printed topo map showing the west buttress approach on Denali. The route choice was intentional. It avoided the standard guided corridor where most regulated traffic is tracked and managed. She didn't hold any permit or authorization for commercial guiding in glaciated terrain. None of the required structure that normally governs that kind of operation.
When I look at choices like that, I usually think about how easy it is to mistake operating outside the system for experience, especially on terrain where that system exists because people have already been hurt without it.
The route moves into remote Alaska Range terrain on Denali, where weather systems develop rapidly and conditions transition into sustained glaciated exposure above 10,000 feet. It is a heavily crevassed and avalanche-prone environment shaped by constant alpine instability and shifting ice formations. In the days before the climb, Denali experienced a destabilizing freeze-thaw cycle. Late warming weakened internal snow structure through melt penetration, followed by rapid refreezing that formed a hard surface crust over unstable layers, a condition that can conceal deeper structural failure within the snowpack. A large ice formation documented days earlier on the upper route showed signs of basal fracture and progressive instability. It circulated informally among climbers, though no formal report was filed. Bexley's route plan, later recovered, passed beneath this Serac band with an estimated clearance of about 60 feet. Standard practice for a feature of that size calls for a buffer of several hundred feet due to potential collapse and debris spread. Her notes contained no mitigation or alternative route adjustments. The group departed the glacier landing zone shortly after first light on Denali. Conditions in the lower basin were cold and overcast, with a low cloud ceiling drifting across the lower Alaska Range and obscuring sections of the mountain above. 19 clients entered the glacier system under Bexley's supervision, accompanied by 4 junior guides whose qualifications and experience were later found to be substantially below commercial expedition standards. The early route passed through broad glaciated valley terrain and exposed moraine fields typical of Denali's lower approach. Visibility was limited beyond the immediate travel line due to cloud cover and flat light. Glacial melt channels and wind-carved ice features bordered sections of the route. Conditions were stable, and the group moved through the lower terrain without incident. With increasing elevation, the terrain shifted from moraine into broken ice field, and then into more exposed alpine glaciated ground. The pace started to slow with the size of the group and the mix of fitness levels. Rest stops stretched out a bit longer each time people regrouped. By late morning, they were already behind the original schedule.
Nothing unsafe yet, but I've seen how these kind of delays quietly shrink the margin you're relying on later without anyone really noticing it happening in real time.
In the mid to upper approach zone, one participant, Phil Renner, started reporting early altitude symptoms: headache, mild nausea. He took medication and kept going after checking in with Bexley. It was noted, but there wasn't a real change in pace or a decision to turn around or reset at that point. The group reached Camp 3 at approximately 14,200 feet in the early evening, later than they'd planned. Above Camp 3, the route continued toward High Camp at approximately 17,200 feet, the final staging point before summit attempts on Denali's upper west buttress. The weather kept shifting, brief, clear breaks where the upper mountain actually came into view across the Alaska Range, then clouds again, swallowing it up. Even from camp, the summit still looked far away, broken into sections across the upper face, but clearly still a long way off. While camp was being established, the schedule for moving higher on the mountain was pushed back again because of the earlier delays. What was supposed to be a midnight departure turned into something later. It doesn't sound like much on paper, but it quietly eats into the buffer you really want up there, especially when timing and surface conditions matter that much. That night it got properly cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing, wind picked up, and sleep didn't really come easily for most people. Some were just lying there, awake for hours. Renner still wasn't feeling right, and a few others were dealing with their own minor issues, taking whatever personal meds they had with them just to get through the night. The following morning, the expedition departed Camp 3 and continued toward the upper mountain, beginning the next stage of the West Buttress ascent. The departure occurred in darkness and cold from approximately 14,200 feet. Temperatures were in the low 20s Fahrenheit, with steady wind moving across the glacier. Cloud cover had returned overnight, limiting visibility to the range of headlamp. Beyond that immediate circle of light, the upper mountain was not visible in any defined form, only an upward slope of terrain. As the group gained elevation onto the upper glacier and ridge system on Denali, terrain conditions transitioned into steeper glaciated slopes. The surface consisted of refrozen snow over softer internal layers, creating inconsistent footing. Crampon technique became critical for stability on the incline. Brief instruction on front point use was provided early in the ascent, though not uniformly across all teams. As a result, technique consistency varied between participants as the slope steepened and visibility remained limited. At approximately 14,800 feet, movement slowed on rope team 2 when one participant, Gerald Fenwick, began to lag. The rope compressed as the team adjusted spacing. He was encouraged to continue and did so. The ascent resumed without a change in overall formation or pace structure. Higher on the route, the group encountered a steep ice step of roughly 20 feet in height. Bexley led the first team over the feature, established a temporary protection point at the top, and brought the remaining clients up individually using a belay system. The process required extended time to complete due to group size, and by its conclusion, daylight was beginning to increase. By the time the entire group had cleared the step, the schedule had fallen significantly behind the planned timeline for the upper mountain. The delay reduced available time margins for the remainder of the ascent, where conditions are typically more dependent on early timing.
I usually pay attention to delays like that because they never really feel serious when they happen, but I've seen enough trips where they quietly pile up, and suddenly you're making decisions with way less time and energy than you thought you had.
From above the step, the upper route and the Serac band on the eastern shoulder of the ridge system came into partial view in the early light. It looked stable, almost clean from that distance, like it was just sitting there in place. From below, it still lined up directly with the planned ascent line. Bexley elected to continue along the original route. The decision was made with knowledge of the feature's presence from the planning map, but without additional updated hazard information beyond what was visible from the slope at that time. The group moved into the upper snowfield as the the angle steepened to about 42 degrees. 3 rope teams stretched across the slope, lead team up high, second team in the middle, third still climbing up from below. It turned into a steady rhythm of movement. Step, plant the axe, reset the feet, step again, over and over. No real pause in it anymore. At that angle, mistakes don't really stay small. They don't stay small at all. A slip becomes a pull becomes a chain reaction through the rope. On refrozen snow especially, where it feels solid but isn't really solid underneath, even a slight misstep can carry through the whole system faster than anyone can recover. Around 15,300 feet, Bexley placed a snow picket and anchored Rope Team 1. The plan, as reflected in her route notes, was to bring the lead team to a flatter section near approximately 13,350 feet to reassess conditions. Standard practice for a feature of that size and instability profile calls for a substantially wider buffer zone due to potential collapse and debris spread, typically measured in several hundred feet. At approximately 15,280 feet, Phil Renner came to a stop on Rope Team 1. The halt was not preceded by any coordinated signal or planned pause. His condition, consistent with progressing altitude illness, had deteriorated during the ascent. He exhibited confusion and loss of coherent movement, and later stated he did not immediately recognize his location or situation. He remained attached to the rope system in the third position on the lead team. His stop caused tension to transfer through the rope line. Rope Team 2, still ascending below, closed distance toward Team 1 as spacing compressed on the slope. Within a short interval, the two teams were brought within close proximity on the same incline, reducing separation between groups to roughly 20 feet in places. No additional intermediate anchors were established between them during this period. By this point, movement was occurring on exposed, steep glaciated terrain on Denali's upper west buttress route, with limited secure anchoring between rope teams. Progress depended entirely on individual crampon placement and ice axe stability on a variable refrozen surface.
I'd be a lot more concerned about the accumulation of little compromises than any single decision. The delayed schedule, the compressed rope teams, the lack of intermediate anchors, none of them exist in isolation anymore.
The group remained below and to the southeast of the Sarek Band, now fully visible in morning light several hundred feet above, positioned along the adjacent to the west buttress route line. From that position, fracture patterns at the base of the ice shelf were discernible to trained observers as signs of structural stress, but the team continued along the planned line with no documented change in route or objective.
When I read that they stayed on the planned line, I don't hear stubbornness as much as I hear how hard it is to step off a plan when the terrain still looks normal enough to justify it.
A shear failure propagated along a pre-existing stress plane in the ice shelf above the eastern shoulder of the west buttress route. The fracture extended across the full width of the shelf within seconds, resulting in complete detachment. The ice mass, estimated at between 800,000 and 1,100,000 pounds, dropped roughly 12 feet before striking the snowfield below. The impact distributed force laterally across a wide zone, producing secondary debris ranging from small ice fragments to blocks approaching 40 pounds, spreading downslope beyond the primary impact area. Of the 24 members of the expedition on the slope at the time, 14 clients and 4 junior guides were positioned within the area, later reconstructed as the primary impact and debris field. The force of the initial impact was sufficient to displace anchors and equipment under significant load. The snow picket placed by Bexley as the anchor for Rope Team 2 failed under the transmitted force traveling through the rope system.
She was unqualified. Honestly, unqualified to the point where calling it a guiding role doesn't really fit what was happening out there.
The placement had been set in relatively unconsolidated snow and at a suboptimal angle, reducing its holding strength. Under the sudden load, the picket was extracted from the snowpack, removing the only effective anchor for that team. Rope Team 2 immediately transitioned into an uncontrolled fall. 7 of the 8 members of Rope Team 2 went down together, all of them, basically at once, sliding roughly 200 feet across that 42-degree slope on the upper west buttress. It's a long way to fall like that, a long, fast, uncontrolled drop, especially on mixed snow like that. As they picked up speed, it just kept building faster and faster. A few of them lost their ice axes almost immediately in the initial chaos, just couldn't hold on to them. And once that happens on that kind of slope, there's really nothing to arrest the fall anymore. No recovery, no reset, just momentum carrying everything downhill. The descending team then struck Rope Team 3, still ascending below. The collision destabilized multiple climbers, causing 4 of 6 members to fall, some directly impacted, others pulled off balance through rope and terrain force transmission. Above them, Bexley and 2 adjacent clients on Rope Team 1 were not hit by the main ice mass, but were affected by secondary debris. Bexley's snow picket briefly held before failing as load propagated through the system. The 2 clients below her were pulled down slow before the system fully failed. Bexley fell last, approximately 11 seconds after the initial collapse. In the immediate aftermath, there were no confirmed uninjured survivors from the ascent party. Emergency services received the signal shortly after and initiated coordinated air and ground response, though access was delayed by terrain and weather constraints. A separate climber, located higher on the route, was later located unresponsive after becoming incapacitated by altitude illness and exposure. The majority of victims fell between roughly 400 and 650 feet across steep snow, ice, and rock transitions on Denali's upper slopes, with some carried onto the upper glacier surface. Bexley's fall ended against a rock band at approximately 10,600 feet, where she was pronounced deceased. All 24 individuals present on the ascent, 19 clients, 4 junior guides, and Bexley died as a result of the event. 14 were killed during the initial fall sequence or from immediate impact trauma, while the remaining deaths occurred shortly afterward due to exposure, injury progression, or a combination of both before rescue access was possible. The PLB signal was received by an air coordination center and relayed to Park Dispatch shortly afterward. Aerial reconnaissance later that morning confirmed multiple stationary figures across a debris field spanning roughly 600 feet on the upper glacier approach. Weather and terrain delayed both air and ground response, and operations shifted from rescue to recovery within hours, continuing over subsequent days. Autopsies attributed 14 deaths to blunt force trauma consistent with a high energy fall, 3 to combined trauma and exposure, and 2 primarily to traumatic brain injury. Bexley died from massive blunt force trauma following a high velocity impact. Toxicology results were negative. A criminal investigation recovered a counterfeit guide certification, a consumer grade laminator, operational records, client payment logs totaling approximately $35,000, and evidence of activity under multiple identifiers, with no valid commercial guiding authorization found under any name used. A formal review concluded the incident resulted from cascading operational failures under an unqualified guiding operation on Denali, including excessive group size, inadequate rope system management, insufficient anchoring, and lack of qualified multi-team leadership. While the Serac collapse was identified as the triggering event, investigators determined that standard guided expedition protocols would likely have prevented a mass fatality under the same conditions.